Welcome everybody to the Battle of Ideas Festival session on History Education, History Wars. My name is Helen Birtwhistle, I'm the chair and producer of this session, and as a history teacher myself I followed the debate this year with both interest and bewilderment. Certainly history education has had an eventful year. Although the new 2014 curriculum has now been published and most parties declare themselves satisfied, the fact remains that an all-out war took place between Michael Gove, Secretary of State for Education, and history educators this year. While at times this war seemed to relate to the content of the curriculum, headlines read that Michael Gove likes the glorious revolution, while some of his opponents prefer chairman under Mao, the argument was also one about how history is taught, imagining Hitler as Mr. Man versus the rote learning of dates, as the headlines told us. Of course, this has been very easy to parody, but the discussion about history education has been an acrimonious one and difficult to get a handle on. If there was one thing that Gove has said on which all parties can agree, it is that there is no part of the new curriculum so likely to prove an ideological battleground for contending armies as history. So I am delighted to have three of the most thoughtful commentators on this debate speaking today, who will no doubt disagree with one another, but I also hope will shed light on what this has really all been about. So let me start by introducing them. Speaking first, to my left, is Professor Jackie Eales, who's president of the Historical Association, which is the major national organisation representing the case for an historical education to policymakers and ministers. She's also been one of the key players in the public discussions around the new curriculum. Jackie is also Professor of Early Modern History at Canterbury Christ Church University, where she is the Director of Research for the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. So it's really brilliant to have you with us. Thank you for coming, Jackie. Speaking second is Professor Frank Furedi, who is an Associate of the Centre for Parent and Culture Studies at the University of Kent and a visiting Professor at the Institute of Risk and Disaster Reduction at University College London. Frank's studies over the past 15 years have been enormously wide-ranging, and so I can't do them any justice here, except to say that his work on both education and on history and historical consciousness make him an important contributor to this debate as well. And last, but by no means least, we have Robert Peel with us on my right, a former history teacher himself, who made waves with his blog for Standpoint magazine on education under the pseudonym Matthew Hunter. Described by Michael Gove as one of the brightest young voices in the education debate, Rob has been a thoughtful and provocative voice on history education over the past few years. So we really do have a wonderful panel to discuss this issue with. So a very warm welcome to them all. I'm going to give the panel an opportunity to share some opening remarks with us all and then open this discussion up to all of you. So, Jackie, if you'd like to start us off.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Is the mic working? Yeah. Great. First of all, I wanted to address why history is a battleground. And I think this stems from the fact that there is no universal canon of what constitutes history. This is the point made by David Cannadine, that every nation has its own distinctive history, and therefore we look to our own past rather than a universal past when we're looking at history primarily. The second point is that there's no one figure as the historian as well. There isn't just one type of historian. There are lots of different types of historians, and this is where debate stems from. So you've got, for example, economic historians, social historians, religious historians, political historians, and so on. And within those approaches, you've got different schools of historical thought. You've got Marxist history, you've got Whig history, empiricist history, determinist history, and so on. So you're going to get a lot of different approaches to how you interpret the past. And the third point here is that the way in which you interpret the past as an individual or as a society says a lot about how you view the present as well. And it's a historical truism, all historians know this. Every generation rewrites its past, looks at past history and rewrites the past, taking into account what's going on currently. So the past, history, isn't a fixed entity that we can all agree on. It's something that's fluid and it depends on our own perspective. So this explains partly why it's a battleground. And I wanted to move on to talk about the national curriculum because, of course, there are two versions of the national curriculum. There was the draft that came out earlier in the year that was open for consultation, and that was the one that attracted so much attention in the press and so much comment. And that consultation period went on over the summer and of course resulted in a final version. And for some reason that final version hasn't been commented on quite so widely. So during the consultation period, the Historical Association went out to its members. We've got 8,000 members, we've got 53 branches nationally, and we took soundings from people who responded to surveys, questionnaires. Over 1,600 people responded, so we had a fairly good evidential base. And our members are members of the general public, but also school teachers, retired school teachers, some of them are retired lawyers, engineers, so we've got a wide range of people who've got different views about history. But overwhelmingly, 96% of our respondents said that the first draft could be improved. And that's what the consultation period over the summer was all about. It was about bodies like the Historical Association, individuals, other societies like the Royal Historical Society feeding into that consultation process. And eventually we got the second final draft, and that really was an improvement in the eyes of our members. That's an improvement. And one of the things that really bothered me about the first version of the national curriculum was that it was very rigidly chronological. Now, I'm a historian, I'm not going to say that there's anything wrong with chronology and dates, but I think you can be over-rigid, you can fetishise dates. And with the first draft, everybody had to get up to 1700 by the age of 11, and then they had to move on from there to do modern history by the age of 14, when of course some of them can drop it. Now for me, I'm a Tudor and Stuart historian, I was really worried about that 1700 cut-off point. Because, I don't know about you, but I don't remember an awful lot about the history I was taught in the classroom at primary school. So I was really worried that a generation of students would come along who had only studied my period up to the age of 11 and wouldn't remember it. And the only things I can remember about primary school history are when we did role play or when we went out on field trips. And field trips had a terrific effect on my learning. I picked up things from field trips very rapidly. So that really bothered me. And the new version, the final draft of the national curriculum, it's got a lot more space for things like local history, which was something that really concerned our members. They wanted to see a lot more local history, as well as English history, British history, and some world history as well. They wanted a mix of different types of history, because that's what history is all about. It's about a mix of different approaches and different time periods and places as well. So from that point of view, it's an improvement. And finally, I just wanted to say something about history teaching in schools today, because I think there's been an awful lot of flack taken by history teachers that somehow the state of our students learning about history is the result of what's going on in the classroom, in history classes, and this is the fault of history teachers. And that somehow in the past there was a golden age of history teaching when everything was all right, and we need to go back to that, we need to find those values again. Well, that's not true, that's not the case. If you look at David Canadine's book, The Right Kind of History, he concludes there was never a golden age of history teaching in the past, and there were a variety of approaches. But what was wrong, perhaps, in the past was a rigid adherence to one type of teaching, and perhaps too much talk and talk with just notes on boards. And that might work if you're a particularly inspiring teacher, but if that's your only approach and you're not really very enthusiastic about the subject that you're teaching, that's going to convey itself to the students. And I think what we've learned about history education over the last 20, 30, 50 years maybe, is that there should be a variety of approaches, that we should pick and mix the approaches we take to history teaching. The one thing that would really improve the understanding of history in our schools is to give history more time as well. There are some schools where only an hour a week is allowed for history classes at secondary level, and of course students drop history at the age of 14. There was a big debate in the past when the national curriculum was drawn up whether history should be taught up to 16 or not, and perhaps that would be the one solution that would give people more time for history. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jackie. Oh, sorry, can you, yes, if you can get the microphone.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me, but I can shout as well. I take history very, very seriously, and it's a personal love of mine. Probably my main passion is the study of history, and both as a professional academic, but also as somebody who's interested in education of children, I am quite distraught about the way in which history is taught in this country. I think of any subject in the curriculum, history is the one that's probably the weakest, the feeblest in terms of its overall approach. And I think that the debate itself on curriculum is interesting as well. It's got very little to do with the content of education. It's very much driven by the fact that we find that British society finds it difficult to give history any meaning. A lot of history teachers find it very difficult to indicate what history means to them and the kind of ideals that they want to communicate to their kids. There is a lot of confusion on that. I think that's partially because the idea of history making, the notion of agency, is also a very diminished one. So the idea that history is something that we make ourselves has really declined in the last 30 or 40 years. We've lost the sense of causality. I mean, even historians are iffy about causality or chronology, causality. Oh my, we're far too indeterminate to take that particularly kind of seriously. So there's a lot of cultural kind of baggage that focuses itself on the history curriculum. And I think that, see, the way that I look at it is that I actually don't care what kind of history is taught. I'm totally pluralistic on that. I can deal with Marxist history, I can deal with King's End, Churchill's history, big, people from above. I don't particularly care, as long as it's history. I mean, as a student in Canada, was more or less kind of brought up on imperial history. And me and my friends spent most of our time rebelling against it. But at least there was a door to kick against. We could, there's a certain body of history that was taught to us. There was a very clear narrative, and we could engage with that, and we could have, as a result of that, I think a very creative education, when we rebelled and all the rest of that. What do you do today? I mean, I can talk about my own family, kids who I know go to school, or other kids, and boys and girls. What do you do today when you have really bright 17, 18-year-old kids, boys and girls, and they like history, and one of them is doing something on the Industrial Revolution, the first term, and the second term they might be doing something about the Norman Conquest, right? I mean, you're worried about ending up in the Tudorian period, but what do you do? I mean, I personally know somebody who's doing something on the Queen Elizabeth moment. He hasn't got a clue about the War of Roses. He doesn't really know what preceded that whole kind of period. And the Tudor period, it just kind of plucked out of, it just so happens that that was the module that he's doing. And even worse, in many schools, kids don't get a chance to even discuss history amongst ourselves, because depending on the teacher, they're all doing different kind of modules. So you can't even have a generational conversation. And that's how seriously we take history. Somebody's doing the Elizabeth moment, somebody else is doing the Civil War, somebody else is doing the Crusades. They're in the same year, they can't even talk to each other. I mean, that whole basic possibility of a conversation is precluded from it. And the history teachers think this is really cool, this is really good. And I think there's a very big problem here, because what has happened, and my criticism of history, and I don't think that the curriculum is actually a solution to that, is that history since for some time, I mean, I don't care about golden ages, but there used to be, for all its sins, history used to have an intellectual content to it, right? There was a very clear content to it. You might disagree with it, but it was an intellectually driven discipline, right? And that was very, very important. Now, a lot of English historians would criticize, oh my God, rote learning, this is really horrible. You have to remember dates, and it's all about dates and chronology. Well, of course, today when we have a skills-based history curriculum, we replace the old-fashioned rote learning with a new rote learning. So if you're doing your AS or A levels, then students are kind of mechanically taught how to do the exam. And if you think for 1 second that teaching in England today is any less mechanical than it was in the past, you're totally wrong. It's just that the mechanical approach is now no longer about dates because they're poo-pooed as being unimportant, no longer about chronology because who wants to know what precedes, something in terms of what has gone on. It's far better that the children, learn to compare and to contrast and get all these historiographical skills. And I think this is really where we kind of failed, because what has happened is that we end up with very clever children, who know very little history. I mean, I can tell you this because I've been teaching sociology now for 45 years. When I started teaching at the University of Kent, I could assume that first-year sociology students knew the difference between a traditional society and a modern society. They heard about the Industrial Revolution. Today, our students have never heard about these things. We can no longer assume, so we have special prep classes, that are designed to help them make up for a lack of historical understanding. And I think the real tragedy is that we've tried to make history more interesting by making more relevant local history, which is what a nonsense, local history. I mean, who needs to teach kids local history? They can get that as they leave at home. But we now spend precious classroom time telling them about their world, whereas they need to escape from their world. They need to transcend it. They need to learn to abstract, through historical knowledge. But no. Canterbury, it's really interesting to know about the street name where you live on, so that's what we teach them because we think that's more relevant. And instead of teaching them real history, we kind of teach them skills that they're not able to use, because to use historiography, you got to know about history in the first place. And we deceive ourselves that we now have this new kind of generation of kids who are ever good at selecting and comparing and everything else, and they end up with a diminished education. And unfortunately, the Gove sort of curriculum actually caved into that. And therefore, we end up with only a marginal improvement of what's done in the past. But the real problem with the history teaching continues to remain, and we're not going to get historically literate kids for a very, very long time to come. Not even in the so-called good schools. Never mind the rest of them.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, I know you're all going to want to speak to one another, so Rob.
I'm going to talk about and largely agree with quite a few of the things that Professor Freddie has just said. I'm far more concerned with history about how it's taught than what is necessarily taught. I became a history teacher just over 2 years ago, and like most teachers, I was very idealistic starting the job, and I found that most of the things I really wanted to do were completely contradicted by how I was told that I should teach. I wanted to teach pupils about astonishing individuals, tell them stories, but I was told that instead I should be teaching them to weigh evidence, source analysis, historical processes. I really wanted to inspire pupils, I wanted to explain complex ideas, but I was told that this was too teacher-led and I should be leaving them to find things out for themselves. And also, when it came to GCSE, I was really looking forward to teaching them about 20th century world history, ideologies, world wars, the Holocaust. Instead, I had to teach a paper which consisted of cowboys and Indians, a history of medicine through time, and what, as far as I could work out, was a geography tourism project into a local castle. And it really was extremely depressing. And I think the most depressing moment, which really summed it up, was before I even started teaching. I had a conversation with the deputy head at my school, and she asked me how I intended to spend the summer preparing. And I said that I'd actually just bought Simon Schama's A History of Britain. I was going to re-watch it just to bone up a bit on my chronological, narrative, historical knowledge. And she looked at me as if I was a bit eccentric and said, "Oh, I wouldn't worry about that. History is a skills-based subject. You can teach it without really knowing anything at all." And I thought I should really give up then. And then during my training, I had to read the 2007 National Curriculum. And I think if you go back and read that curriculum that was passed in 2007, you really will appreciate how much of an improvement, with its imperfections, the June draft of Gove's new curriculum is. It really made me think that I was choosing the wrong career. The first 4 pages are a list of historical processes and concepts, and events from the past aren't even mentioned. And they're dull, they're mechanistic. That's the really utilitarian type of history teaching. It's not fact learning, it's this obsession over processes and concepts. And only then, right at the end, you get to any list of content that you actually teach, and it's completely superficial. The only 2 events that they mention are the Holocaust and the French Revolution. And I just thought this really is not the subject that I'm hoping to teach. So I would say that a lot of the academics who attack Gove's new curriculum, I think very few of them will have actually read what it was that he was replacing, and if they did, they'd be a little bit more cautious in the criticism that they give. So to give a bit of a historical perspective, these misguided ideas about teaching history that I'm alluding to, they all became very, very popular in the 1970s when history as a subject was completely reconceptualised and a new discipline called new history was invented. Maybe an oxymoron, I'm not sure. Anyway, the organisation who started this were called the Schools Council History Project, and they thought that the sort of teaching that had happened was dull, old-fashioned, traditional, and they wanted to reinvigorate the subject by empowering pupils to learn history for themselves from primary sources. So instead of teaching them history, you'll be teaching them how to be historians. And when you read it, if you read the proposals that were made in the 1970s, it does sound very inspiring. It can be quite seductive. But actually there are some deep, deep problems with this idea of teaching history. And it's been so influential, the Schools Council, Schools History Projects, they came to be known. They've changed how textbooks look, they've changed what the GCSE looks like, and I think it's been very, very detrimental. I'll give 3 main reasons why I think this is. Firstly, I think it makes history a lot more boring. You move away from the stuff of history, which makes it really interesting, and you teach pupils that the most inspiring thing they can do is say, this source is biased because. Or, if you really want to make an exceptional pupil, you get them to say, this source is one-sided because. I was told in my training that that really distinguishes the A-star pupils, one-sided instead of biased. Anyway, also, I would say it leaves pupils with very little historical knowledge. Now, there are lots of people in the history profession who seem to think this isn't a problem, which I just find so confusing. Further to what Professor Freddie said, an economics professor at Cardiff University was so worried about his undergraduates at a good university having no knowledge of history that he did a test. 284 of them who came in their first year, he tested them on their basic historical knowledge. He asked them, name one 19th century prime minister. A huge amount of these pupils had been to private schools, they'd all got good A-levels, 11% could answer that question. So for an economics professor who would assume that if he said Gladstonian liberalism or Peel's reforms, that would just, be a capable thing to do to have an intelligent conversation, his undergraduates couldn't do that. And that's really, really dangerous. And I'd say that's a legacy of how history changed. And then lastly, the skills that they aim to teach aren't even very good skills anyway. Professor Robert Toombs, who's at Cambridge University, he wrote a report about how history is taught in schools. And he concluded that these skills are hollow and mean little. So why as teachers at schools we insist on doing these if academics don't even respect them, I'm not sure. So I would say that with many, many qualifications, I am broadly very much in favour of the way that Gove is trying to change the way that history is taught. I don't have much faith in how able he will be able to do that as a politician, because I think that it's a huge cultural problem within schools which will take decades really to overturn, but at least it's a start that he's trying, I would say. And just to end, if you don't believe me, Tony Judt, he's one of my favourite historians, he's a real hero of mine. He was a left-wing historian, changed a bit towards the end of his career. He was from South London, he won a scholarship to a direct grant school where he did his O-levels, no source analysis, and then that was just 5 essays for the exam, that was it. Catapulted him to Cambridge University, went on to be this towering public intellectual. He was, in his memoirs, very, very negative about how history is taught and was quite a critic of what you could broadly call progressive education. And he said, from teaching 3rd graders to teaching graduate students, experience has taught me this. It's universally true that young people who don't yet know history prefer it to be taught in the most conventional and straightforward way. And I broadly agree.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, I just want to give you all a chance to speak to one another before we then quickly go out to the audience. So, Jackie, it does seem like a while ago that we heard from you. I just wonder what you've made of the arguments put forward by Frank and Rob.
Yes, I mean, I was talking about the national curriculum up to the age of 14, and that would give people a basis, a grounding in history. But I think the discussion moved on to talk about GCSE and A-level. And if we're talking about GCSE and A-level, then we are looking at a very different picture, and I admit that. One problem is that it's possible to repeat subjects that you've studied at GCSE at A-level, and Rob was saying he wanted to teach the Holocaust. Well, that's the most commonly taught subject. And sometimes I have undergraduates who come to me and they say, I've been taught the Holocaust 3 times, at Key Stage 3 again at GCSE and A-level, and I'm sick to death of it. And there is some responsibility here, I think, with the exam boards, because they put on rather narrow syllabuses. They allow students to repeat for public exams subjects that they've done at GCSE and A-level, and I think that needs to be addressed very heavily. So that's quite a problem. But I respect what Frank was saying about having taught undergraduates at the University of Kent, and I've got 30 years of experience of teaching undergraduate historians who study A-level history, and when they come to me, they do know their history. It might be very narrow because of the syllabuses, but increasingly it's becoming more varied. And I was talking to Helen about teaching China and Chairman Mao. A lot of students are very interested in that and combine it with other types of history. But we're assuming that when the students are studying GCSE and A-level, they're going to have to specialise. They can't do the whole of history. Because they're studying Elizabeth I at GCSE or A-level, they can't go back and do the Wars of the Roses, because if you do the Wars of the Roses, well, what comes before that? You want to go back and do the 100 Years' War, and then you want to go back into the Middle Ages. Well, we hope that that's been covered at an earlier stage, and that's where, well, this is where perhaps the new curriculum might push people in that direction. But for A-levels, certainly you're going to expect students to be specialising, so I'm not surprised that they have silos of understanding at A-level.
Frank, is there anything you want to...
Well, just a little point, which is, I mean, as a parent, I've been tracking, the whole business, and also talking to other parents, interviewing them. And I think what's very interesting, I mean, my experience was, I went to a really crap state school, I mean, as bad as it got. But we did begin with the history of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, after which went on and looked at, sort of the kings of England, after which it's in Canada, we then looked at the history of Canada. By grade 4 I had done that, and then we went on and gradually became more and more specialized. Children in this country, even in the best independent schools and the best state schools, never get that kind of history. Absolutely, I mean, what they do is, children who are as old as 11 are playing around with these worksheets. We get them these little worksheets, about the Bayeux tapestry, So instead of discussing, what the Normans do in England, they mess around and color in tapestries, sort of a really good skill, to be able to do stuff like that. And so what happens is that when they do their A-levels, it's not that you can assume that they know anything, because they don't. And when they do specialized modules, they get parachuted in. I mean, I know young boys and girls who are 16, they get parachuted in to do something on the Crusades. I mean, they don't even know what the Middle Ages are. Right? They never study any of that kind of stuff. So what we're actually doing is we're playing with them. Because what we're doing is we're treating history like a story from a literary book. It's like literature, you give them Jane Austen. You don't have to read, an earlier novel by somebody else to give Jane Austen. But in history, you have a responsibility to contextualize, to give a certain kind of background to that. And I think that's really where we're failing down. And I think the really horrible thing is that we deceive. I did a huge argument at a conference of historians. They actually believe that they're teaching their students skills, valuable, transferable skills. But as you're saying, the skills they teach them are really very weak, very feeble, almost commonsensical. But what's even worse, they're not really skills, because they're not contextualized, and they're not kind of really based upon what we call real historiography. It's not based upon because they haven't got the capacity to weigh up evidence. When you haven't got the evidence, what you're weighing up is hot air, and that's really the difficulty we're in.
One thing I've been wondering is why there has been such a kind of ferocious attack from history teachers themselves. So Jackie mentioned the 96% of history educators who weren't satisfied with the original proposals. So where does that kind of ferocity come from?
It's a very good question, because it's something I ask myself a lot, and I answered the Historical Association survey, and I was one of the 4% who weren't at 96%, and I thought it generally was a bit of an improvement. So I do wonder about this myself. And I think partially it's because the February draft of the national curriculum was pretty misguided in quite a few ways, and in ways that did really rile people. So writing of Clive of India isn't that sensible, and it's going to turn people off it. So I think it was understandable for that reason. I think more importantly though, what Gove is trying to do does fly in the face of what most young history teachers will have heard of, broadly speaking, with some exceptions, on their PGCE, from exam boards, in the textbooks, and to have to completely reconceptualise their subject and take on what Gove is saying actually takes quite a leap of faith. And to ignore what you've always been told by Ofsted and senior staff members at your school and think that actually a Tory education minister is right, is quite a difficult thing to do. So that's why.
Okay, we're going to go out to the audience and take some questions and thoughts, and then come back to the panel. So, could I get somebody at the front here?
Yeah, Chris McGovern, Director of the History Curriculum Association and Chairman of the Campaign for Real Education. We have a stall downstairs. Just want to nail one myth, and it relates to the last point which Robert made. Why don't teachers oppose this? 25 years ago, I was a dissident voice, and with a colleague, we lost our livelihoods. The reason why there's not much dissent is because if you dissent, you lose your livelihood, or you don't have any career within teaching. This was raised in Parliament. It was compared to what was going on in East Germany. It was also raised by the Prime Minister. So I say on good authority, there is no debate because there's been a filtering of history teachers over the years. With regard to the new history curriculum, the skills, by the way, can be taught using The Hobbit much more effectively than using historical material. Published research on this in The Guardian. The problem with the new national curriculum is very simple. It spends twice as many words defining how to teach the subject as it does on content. It defines the subject in terms of skills, concepts, and this is contested. The only thing unique about history is that it is knowledge of the past. Everything else can be taught using fiction. And I think the subject has been betrayed. Not the end of the war, by the way. It's just another battle. We will carry on criticising it. You'll read us in the Daily Mail. Thank you very much.
Next to you.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask you, what is history? Or indeed actually, is history even real? Because I was, when I saw Professor Alan Munslow at the Wallace Collection a few months ago, he seemed to think that the past and history were two totally separate things, and the past is dead. Well, I think he was a bit mad when he said that, but at the same time I do think he made some very good points. At the Sixth Form History Society a couple of days ago, one of my friends sort of like held a debate, I suppose you could say, on exactly what is history, and he put it in quite a very nice way. That history is the impressions that we leave behind in the world, just like the footprints that a dinosaur left behind. Some of them just got washed away and were never seen again, but others were fossilised and stayed around for much longer after the dinosaur. Now, I very much liked that analogy by my friend, but I actually think it goes, we should go one step further. And history isn't just about those impressions, isn't just about those footprints. It's about how we collate them together to form an argument, and so that we can try and understand and we can debate about what truly happened, what was real, what wasn't real. And so, as much as I do definitely feel that there is perhaps far too much emphasis on sources and skills, and indeed actually Robert and indeed a couple of the other panellists as well mentioned that the skills are hollow, but I would like to say that the facts are hollow. Yes, I do like the facts. I mean, I very much like history, but not everybody does. And unless I become something like a historian or a history teacher, which I might do, but not every history A-level student does, these facts are utterly meaningless, and these skills that are so-called hollow are actually the only things that are transferable to real life.
Okay, transferable skills. Just over here, please.
Thanks. Could I ask the panel a question about the history of history, which is, this is my question, what's unique about the crisis of historical authority today? Because we do seem to have a peculiar situation where nobody seems to have any authority, and that seems to me something interesting.
Okay, thank you. Man with beard and check shirt. Oh.
Instantly recognisable. I'm instinctively drawn to what Frank and, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name, Robert, are saying about the current teaching of, their rather pessimistic view of the current teaching of history, and yet it sounds like the description that you gave of the 1970s report had a direct influence on the way I was taught history, and actually probably made me a Marxist at the time, because we were given the opportunity to explore at the time the Derby race where the suffragette was killed, and that was explored in terms of, well, this was the official representation, but if you look at it more carefully, you can see that there is possibly a different interpretation. And that actually exposed me to the idea that there is another version of history that is not necessarily the one that you're going to be taught. So while I'm and there is an argument also for saying that the only benefit of knowing the kings and queens or 19th century prime ministers is to get high marks on the university challenge. So I'm curious to know more about why you think this is so important, when perhaps the only thing that's important in education is to arouse. I mean, I'm still very interested in history, and I go out and I go to museums and look at Roman history and Greek history and whatnot. But that's because I've been given a sense of curiosity more than a sense of the dates or what have I can learn those now. I don't necessarily need to have learned them then. So I'm interested in why you think it's as big a problem in some ways. I'm not sure if you've explained that fully.
No, that's brilliant, thank you. Sean Lang is at the back there, is that right? Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Sean Lang. I lecture at Anglia Ruskin University, also a former teacher, sixth form teacher, and I lead the Better History Forum. I think the Historical Association has got itself in a very, very difficult and contradictory situation, and Jackie has rather confirmed that today. Because on the one hand, you've heard the sort of problems that have been with history teaching, and yet at the same time, again as you've heard, the association tends to defend everything in the classroom as if wherever the fault might lie, it doesn't lie there, and can't do. Effectively, it's supporting the idea that David Cannadine has given of a sort of new mythology. And this mythology is this idea that there was never a golden age. Well, I don't believe in golden ages, and I've never, in 30 years, involved in history education, met anyone who does. But I don't believe in the bad old days either, which is effectively what David has created. Just to illustrate what I'm on about, take A-level. At A-level, it is almost impossible to find anyone who has actually done a period of history. We do a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So quite, not making this up, but have someone coming through with A-level doing one module on only one aspect of Nazi Germany, just one aspect, and then maybe another on Britain at war over 100 years, but nothing else about Britain in that period. And there may be a bit of Henry VIII, and maybe something completely different for the fourth one. Now, it compared with only 10 years or so ago, where you would have 100 years worth of history, very often from two angles, British, European, whatever. Similar sort of desiccation at GCSE, with continual reduction in the amount of coverage in actual history teaching. It's not just saying, well, this is the exam boards, allowing it to happen. It's just teachers choosing which modules and which choices to make. Widespread discounting of the importance of historical knowledge. Historical knowledge, wider and ever wider historical knowledge, is what makes historians better historians. And I've heard it too many times from teachers and from history educationists that historical knowledge doesn't really matter. Robert's absolutely right. It's that sort of thing that you hear from heads as well.
Okay.
And so on. So effectively, we have to say something's gone wrong and not be afraid to say some of that is in the classroom.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to come back to the panel, and I will come back out for another round. So, tackle anything there. It was obviously wide-ranging questions. Frank, do you want to start us off?
Can we have some more ventilation, please? Sweltering in.
I can go like this. I think there are two myths I just like to, kind of do away. First of all, this is not a left and right thing, right? I mean, I'm about as left as they come, but I'm a big believer in classical historical studies, and I take a very traditionalist approach towards the teaching of history. And the reason why I do it, to answer your question, why facts are important, has got to do with the nature of education at the moment. It isn't just history, but every subject that faces a very strong anti-intellectual, utilitarian kind of assault. And you'll find that the content of all the disciplines is being seen as being secondary to the skills aspect of it, not just in history. You get that in literature. You get that in literary criticism. It's seen as being more important, actually, loving cultivating the love of reading. Literary skills are seen as being more important than loving literature. So we get it everywhere. For me, as someone that studied history, the reason why facts are important, the really boring facts, is the same reason why we have to teach timetables to children in mathematics. Now, I know it sounds very boring, 2 times 2 is 4. And I know in many schools you don't do the times table anymore. I've talked to 11-year-old children, I'm not making this from down in Kent, who do not know their timetables. Right? I mean, they actually don't know their timetables, and they're 11 years old, and they teach think that's cool. That's, chill out, Frank, Maybe by the time the old age pensioners, depending which role. So it seems to me that, you need to have the content, the basic infrastructure of history, in order for, which basically creates a sense of perspective, before we can begin to discuss questions like what is history. I mean, unless you know that there are important differences, you can't periodize, you cannot make clear distinctions. I mean, how can you periodize, which is one of the most elementary skills in history, unless you know the fact that there are these variations in human development. So the point I'm really trying to get at is that by in a sense, pathologizing the content of history, and really kind of dismissing the importance of dates and names and everything else, what we're left with is a story. And which is why history resembles increasingly, sort of fiction more and more, rather than the study of anything that is remotely analyzable in any kind of objective terms.
Thank you. Jackie?
Yes, thank you. Well, it's a very wide range of questions there, and a young gentleman here was saying, are facts hollow? Are skills hollow? Gentleman over there was saying, perhaps skills are very important. What is history? I think this is quite a basic point that we perhaps need to address at this point. History isn't just the past. As an intellectual discipline, it's the facts that the experts pull out from the past and tell us are important. And one of the key skills that history teaches us is to be very critical of what we're taught. So one of the whole points of teaching history is to make individuals aware of the fact that there isn't this great canon of dates. There isn't actually a great canon of periodisation as well. And who says which periods are important? Who says that those periods can't change? Who says that those periods can't be narrowed or elongated? So there is a sense in which individuals have to make those kinds of judgments for themselves. They're not just handed down. And we were asking earlier about why is there a crisis in history teaching. I'm not so sure there is a crisis in history teaching. I think there are some myths flying around that are being reinforced from various angles. And one of those is that there is a crisis. What is the evidence for this crisis? When students come to me, they understand historical method, they understand the history periods they've been taught. It would be nice if they knew more history, but believe you me, none of us knows enough history. There's room for all of us to know more history.
But do you recognise, Jackie, the idea that perhaps the skills and concepts of history have been fetishised within the history education?
I don't think so. I think that what it's done is opened up history as a discipline, because as an intellectual discipline, it rests on primary sources. It rests on the analysis of comments by individuals at the time. And I think to try and teach history purely through a sequence of dates and secondary interpretations is actually to rob young children of that experience of what history is really about.
I would say that a lot of this seems to be coming around the skills versus knowledge debate that a lot of people say is a false dichotomy. I think the best way to think of it is a process, and the first stage in the process always has to be the knowledge. And that's true when it comes to curiosity as well. So in answer to the man in the check shirts question about whether having a chronological narrative-based history education is necessary for curiosity, I would say that a lot of people who think that maybe it isn't tend to underestimate their own knowledge. If you try and imagine, not knowing whether the Tudors or Stuarts came first, not knowing where Elizabeth I relates to Victoria, this is the condition that a lot of people are in when they leave school. And I would say if you're in that condition, you will have very little curiosity about history. You'll just have a sense of bewilderment about it. So I'd say that it's easy to characterise this as rote learning kings and queens, and I don't think you'll find a history teacher in the country who would advocate something as regimented as that. but at least giving some idea of overview before you try and move on to the more technical things is absolutely vital. And I'd say, in response to the idea that it's somehow good or important for pupils at the primary and key stage 3 stage, which is where the history curriculum covers, to have some idea of historical method, I'm just not sure it is. I didn't even do historical method in the first year of my degree. I came to it in the third year of my degree when I had a really, really good wealth of knowledge about a period, and that's when I was allowed to actually dally in some primary sources and write a dissertation. So I would say that I actually think that it's really a bit of a wrong turn, thinking that that is what school history should consist of.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, there are loads of people that want to ask questions, so I'd ask you to be super quick so that we can take as many as we can and then come back against the panel. Yes.
Surely history as a subject shouldn't just be analytical, but it's content as much as context. You have to know what's going on around it. So I think it should be, at the same time as you're studying a period, you should study the period of where around what's happening. So you can understand what happened and why it happened, rather than just spoon-feeding facts and saying that's what happened and just say that in your exam.
Thank you. Yeah, just there. Stroke shirt.
Yeah, just a couple of things. Coming back to Sean Lang's point earlier about the hollowing out of the curriculum, I think we can date that very much to curriculum 2000. And I remember seeing the difference between the old A-level syllabus, which did used to cover that extent, and then the new AS modules. And of course the way it's arranged does encourage game playing in terms of picking modules and shortening periods and trying to keep the content down, and it's very hard to resist the temptation to do that. The other question, just to very quickly, rather than asking what is history, I think the other thing to ask is what is history for? And I was very influenced a few years ago by Ed Hussein's book, The Islamist, and he described the thing that changed him more than anything else was an A-level history teacher. And the answer to all the questions that Ed Hussein had were always, it depends. And it was that thing about, the thing that history teaches is everything's contingent and there's space for tolerance.
Thank you. Over here at the end there with the scarf, the woman behind you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the panel to comment further on the problem of teaching chronology as children are getting older. And I'm trained as a medievalist, and so my problem is even worse than Jackie's, that the period that I would generally like to advocate for is the period that the children are taught when they're very young indeed. And no matter how keen you are on intellectual content, and I am, inevitably you are going to end up with having to make age-appropriate concessions with your content and how you teach it. So I'd like to know more about how the panel would tackle that.
Okay, thank you. The man with the pink shirt.
I don't know much about history, so I'll ask this old chestnut. Has teaching history in schools got anything to do with social cohesion?
Okay, thanks. And right at the back, one of those hands.
A couple of points. One, I thought it was interesting perhaps to ask, surely this debate has been had many times before in the past. I'm sure this is not a new question about the correct methodology of history teaching. I'm surprised that the panel hasn't spent more time talking about the history of this question, let's just say. The other thing I wanted to ask, maybe to Frank, you mentioned the anti-intellectualism, which you felt was behind the undermining of the curriculum and the way history is taught today. Are there any other underlying causes, you think? I'm thinking particularly of something that I read Theodore Dalrymple mentioned, which was sentimentality or sentimentalism. Whether you thought there were any other underlying causes like that?
Thank you. Mark Taylor.
Thanks. I'm London convener of the Education Forum, so we talk about this a lot, but I'm also a history teacher. Much as I agree with the sentiments that the chronology's gone out, I think you've got a few facts wrong. When we were doing source papers and sending in students that said this is biased, our students were failing. I think most examples would not pass you if you don't put sources within context. So I don't know whether it's just your school or there is a general trend. I do accept that there is, but I'm looking for a bit more of the sort of what did you do about it, instead of blaming all the others around you. But I think I might have the same accusation to Frank. because I haven't seen an exam board that completely misses chronology. For example, the Welsh exam board at GCSE is widely criticised for being simple, but OCR does include the end of the British Empire, which includes India, Kenya, plus the Cold War, which they all do as well. I accept that no exam board does any kind of chronological overview at all, and I think that must be a major gap in the whole system of students going into education, into universities. There is simply, as far as I can see, no attempt to get a student's overall knowledge examined and analysed. But isn't that the job of the universities to say we ain't letting you in? And therefore putting it back to there's definitely a sort of Philistine approach going here, a very technical approach in schools, there's no doubt about it. But we did put in ancient Greece and Rome, you're right, but we put it in and I've done okay on it, and people say that was the right thing to do. I'm not saying I didn't get the exam results straight away, but there was not everybody out there as a Philistine. But I do think that maybe the universities could help, or Gove could say, let's put that time back into the curriculum, which would perhaps be more of an act of political courage than just tinkering around with the curriculum.
Thanks.
One of the things we've not talked much about is history teachers, and surely one of the problems here is that the curriculum needs to be so broad at both primary and secondary level that what you need to teach it is enthusiastic generalists, and that's not actually that common a type. I mean, I'm a university historian, I'm actually a colleague of Sean's, although I'm head of English, fun story. And my own experience of historians is that quite a lot of them focus and focus and focus. And if, like me, you are an enthusiastic generalist, you get called a dilettante. So you've got to find a group of people who aren't being encouraged in the first place. And the exam boards are trying to create curricula that are meant to allow people to drop lots of different material into, but the people who could do that aren't necessarily there.
Okay, thanks. And there are two women here, and I'm afraid we're going to have to finish it off there.
I'd just like to ask a question about this not being so much a curriculum issue as much as it being an issue of what is the goal when we're teaching students. So if our goal is always to fit them into this A-level category, or like, you need to pass this exam and this is going to be the expectation of how you can perform, then firstly, I think that you quell that curiosity. Because if what you're concerned with is that score, that A star, or whatever, then there's nothing that is going to invite you to engage with material more in a general sense, or even lasting throughout your life. It's like, I need to get through this exam to do this, to do this, to do this. And so if there's less pressure put on teachers to put their students into this box or category, then don't you think that would be a more compelling way to get that content in there and people wanting to engage with a narrative, something that is more long-lasting or more influential in their lives? And so I feel that maybe it looks like bureaucracy, which is getting involved. That's the problem.
Okay, I'm so sorry, we're going to have to finish it there. We've completely run out of time. So I'm going to ask you all to give some closing remarks to some very diverse questions and points there. So, Rob, do you want to start off?
I suppose it's something interesting that hasn't been addressed. A lot of people are asking, what is history for? And saying that we need to answer that before we can have any of this debate. I would say it certainly is not for giving you transferable skills to apply in the workforce. I think that is a horribly depressing answer to give. History quite simply allows you to understand the world in which you live and the human condition. It's philosophy by examples. And whatever area of history you study, if you do it right, it will allow you to do that.
Thanks very much. Jackie?
Well, I'd add to that by revisiting something I said earlier, that history makes individuals critical, and it ensures that they are understanding of the political and social environment in which they live and can challenge it as well.
Thanks. Frank?
Yeah, I agree that history makes people critical, but the way we teach history makes them uncritically critical, which is what skilled education is, where 6-year-olds are invited to discuss whether this source is biased or one-sided. I think that's a big stretch, and I think it's an evasion of adult responsibility, where very profound historiographical questions that I struggled with as a PhD student are being revisited on 7-year-olds, on the grounds that this is, sort of very creative. We don't have one history, there are many histories, is actually avoiding our responsibility for teaching, because the point is that there's a process here. And I can tell you that I got my PhD in African history. My book was published a year later. It's still a standard text after 25 whatever years. I didn't do any primary research until I did my PhD. So I managed to contrive to go to high school, get my first degree, get an MA, without touching a single sort of sliver of primary research. I survived because there was so much in history itself that I had to learn to become a historian, to master the subject, that it required me to do proper research in an archive as a PhD. And that's when all these big questions were properly answered. And to imagine that the things that I was doing, maybe I'm a little bit thick, not as intelligent as other people, but the thing that I was engaging with at that point is now, the kind of things that we're discussing with children actually, turns, the subject into a myth. We're kind of pretending to be teaching skills. It sounds very comparatist and do that, but actually what we're doing is we're feeding children with the kind of rote learning that the worst scholastic education did in the medieval period. Actually, scholastic education was far more creative because at least it recognized there's a relationship between faith and reason. This history is entirely faith-based.